I broke up with my boyfriend over his bizarre eating habits. Now he's blaming me for ruining his life and his friends. Won't let him live it down. Here's the situation. I, 28F, met this guy, Jake, 30M, on a dating app. He seemed like a good match. Funny, smart, and we had some common interests. After a couple of weeks of texting, we decided to meet up for dinner. For context, I'm a sous chef, and I come from a culture where food is a huge part of life. Sharing meals and trying new dishes are essential to me, not just because of my job, but because it's part of how I connect with others. Our first date was at a nice Italian restaurant, and that's when I first noticed something was off. Jake spent a ridiculous amount of time asking the waiter about every single dish. When it was finally time to order, he settled on plain pasta with butter. No sauce, no toppings, just noodles and butter. It struck me as odd, but I shrugged it off, thinking maybe he just wasn't feeling adventurous that night. Then we went out again, and I suggested sushi. Jake made a face and said he doesn't eat seafood or anything that's uncooked, so we ended up at a diner instead. Once again, he interrogated the waiter about every item on the menu before finally ordering a plain cheeseburger with nothing on it. Just meat, cheese, and bread. This was starting to become a pattern. Over the next few dates, it became clear that Jake was extremely picky, not because of allergies or a medical condition like RFID, but simply because he refused to try anything unfamiliar. He avoided sauces, spices, vegetables, basically anything that wasn't super basic. Every meal turned into a challenge, and he even made faces or comments about dishes I enjoyed, which started to feel disrespectful, considering my background. The breaking point came when I invited Jake to a potluck dinner hosted by one of my colleagues. It was a big event with lots of homemade dishes from various cultures. Exactly the kind of thing I love. When we arrived, Jake immediately looked uncomfortable. As we moved through the buffet line, he barely put anything on his plate. He kept making comments like, "This looks weird," or, "I don't trust food that has too many ingredients." I was embarrassed, especially since these were my colleagues and friends who had spent a lot of time preparing these dishes. Jake picked at his food and eventually whispered to me that he was going to leave and grab some fries from a fast food place nearby because he couldn't eat this stuff. He left the potluck early, leaving me to make excuses for his absence. That was when I realized this wasn't going to work. Food is such a significant part of my life and my culture, and I need someone who can share that with me. So I decided to end things with Jake. To avoid hurting his feelings, I told him it was because I wasn't ready for a serious relationship right now. But Jake wouldn't let it go. He kept texting and calling, insisting that he deserved to know the real reason. After a week of him pestering me, I finally told him the truth. That his extremely picky eating habits were a major issue for me, and I couldn't see a future where food wasn't a constant point of tension. Jake was livid. He accused me of being shallow and said it was ridiculous to end things over something as trivial as food. He told me I was making a big mistake and that I was missing out on a great relationship over something that shouldn't even matter. Now I'm left wondering, was I the asshole for telling him the real reason I didn't want to date him? Update 1. Hey everyone, thanks for the responses. I didn't expect my story to blow up like this. To answer a few questions, I want to clarify that I don't think Jake is a bad person, just someone who is very set in his ways. I appreciate all the perspectives, and they've helped me feel more confident in my decision. But things got a little weirder after I posted. After I told Jake the real reason for the breakup, I thought that would be the end of it. I was wrong. A few days later, Jake showed up at my apartment with a bag of groceries. I was surprised to see him, but he insisted he wanted to talk. He said he had been thinking a lot about what I said and wanted to make it up to me by cooking dinner together. I was hesitant, but he looked so sincere, and I figured maybe this was his way of showing he was willing to try. So, I agreed. We started cooking together, but right from the start it was clear that Jake had no idea what he was doing. He was chopping vegetables like he was afraid they'd bite him, and he seemed genuinely baffled by basic ingredients like garlic and onions. But the strangest part was when we started cooking the meat. I had suggested a simple chicken dish with some spices, and when I handed him the chicken, he just stared at it. After a few awkward moments, he finally admitted that he had never cooked anything from scratch before. He'd always relied on pre-cooked meals, takeout, or his mom's cooking. I was floored. How does a 30-year-old man not know how to cook anything? I tried to be patient and guided him through the process, but it was like teaching a toddler. He kept asking questions like, "Is this safe to eat?" Or, "Why does it smell like that?" At one point, he actually gagged when I was sautéing the onions. It was a mess. The final product was edible, but barely. He didn't even touch it. After all that effort, he ended up ordering a pizza. After dinner, Jake sat me down and said he really liked me and wanted to make this work, but he just couldn't change who he was. He asked if I could compromise and accept that he would never be into the same foods as me. He even suggested that we could always eat separate meals when we go out or stay in. I was stunned. It wasn't just about the food. It was about what the food represented. I tried to explain that to him, but he just didn't get it. He kept insisting that if we just ignored the food issue, we'd be fine. That night made me realize how deeply ingrained Jake's habits were. It wasn't just that he was picky. It was that he was completely uninterested in trying anything new, even for the sake of our relationship. I told him I couldn't be with someone who was so unwilling to grow or change, especially when it came to something so important to me. Jake left, and I haven't heard from him since. I'm still processing everything, but I'm more confident now that I made the right choice. I deserve someone who can share all aspects of life with me, including the joy of food. Update 2. I wasn't expecting to update again, but something happened that I just have to share. A few weeks after the last incident with Jake, I was starting to move on. I even went on a couple of dates with a new guy who actually enjoys trying new foods, a breath of fresh air. But then, out of the blue, Jake reached out to me again. This time, his tone was completely different. He wasn't apologizing or asking to get back together. Instead, he was furious. He accused me of ruining his life and said that because of me, his friends and family were questioning his masculinity and maturity. Apparently, after our breakup, Jake had vented to some of his buddies about how ridiculous I was for ending things over food. But instead of backing him up, they started teasing him about his picky eating habits. From what Jake told me, his friends had a field day with it. They started calling him Chicken Nugget Jake and refusing to let him pick where they'd go out to eat. Some even joked that he was acting like a man-child who couldn't handle anything beyond a kid's menu. It got so bad that Jake stopped hanging out with them as much because he couldn't take the constant ribbing. It didn't stop there. Jake's mom got wind of what happened, and apparently, she wasn't too pleased either. She started pushing him to grow up and try to be more open-minded about food. Jake said she even tried to cook more adventurous meals for him, but he refused to eat them, which only made things more tense at home. Jake told me that because of all this pressure, he was feeling depressed and isolated. He said he wished he'd never met me, and that I'd ruined his simple, happy life. I was honestly shocked. I never intended for things to get so out of hand. I told Jake that I was sorry he was feeling this way, but that I stood by my decision. It wasn't my fault that his friends and family were reacting the way they were. But Jake wasn't having it. He called me selfish and accused me of poisoning his life. He ended the conversation by saying he never wanted to see or hear from me again. It was a bizarre and sad ending to what I thought was already over. Now I'm left feeling conflicted. On one hand, I know I did the right thing for myself by ending the relationship. But on the other hand, I never wanted to cause Jake this much distress. It's been a tough few weeks, but I'm trying to focus on moving forward and finding someone who truly aligns with my values. Update 3. I'm honestly floored right now, and I need to share this because I can't believe what just happened. After everything that went down with Jake, I thought I was finally done with this whole mess. But life has a funny way of surprising you. So, I was at a work event, a big industry networking dinner, when I ran into Jake. To say I was shocked would be an understatement. I had no idea he'd be there. I later found out he was attending as a guest of someone else, a friend of a friend who works in the same industry. I tried to keep my distance, but of course we ended up running into each other. Jake looked different. He was dressed up, more polished than I'd ever seen him, and he actually looked like he belonged there. He came over to talk to me, and to my surprise, he was calm. No anger, no accusations. He started by apologizing for how he'd acted during our last conversation. He said he'd been in a bad place, lashing out because he didn't know how to deal with the fallout of our breakup. Then he dropped a bombshell. Jake told me that after our last conversation, he hit rock bottom and realized he couldn't keep living the way he was. His friends' teasing and his mom's disappointment finally got to him, and he decided to make some changes. He enrolled in a cooking class. Yes, an actual cooking class, to try and learn more about food and overcome his fear of trying new things. At first, he hated it. He said he almost quit multiple times, but something inside him told him to keep going. The more he learned, the more he realized how much he'd been missing out on. It wasn't just about the food. It was about the experiences, the connections, the whole cultural aspect that I'd tried to share with him. Jake told me that he's still picky, but he's working on it. He's tried more new foods in the last few months than he ever had in his entire life. And while he still has a long way to go, he feels like a different person. He even joked that he's finally starting to understand what I was talking about when I said food was more than just sustenance. But here's the kicker. Jake said that while he's proud of the progress he's made, he's not asking for another chance. He said he knows he's still not the right person for me because he's too set in his ways. He just wanted to apologize for how things ended and let me know that our relationship was the catalyst for him to start changing his life. I was speechless. I didn't know what to say, so I just thanked him for telling me. We talked a bit more about life, and then he wished me well and walked away. It was the closure I didn't know I needed. As I'm writing this, I'm feeling a mix of emotions: relief, sadness, but also a weird sense of pride. I didn't expect Jake to change, and while we're not getting back together, I'm glad that something positive came out of all this. I'm moving on, but I'll always remember this experience as a reminder that sometimes people can surprise you in ways you never imagined.